Third step in our milling process involves the table saw. So step one of our milling process, we plane it to thickness. Step two in our milling process, we put one straight edge on it, we joint it. And the third step of our milling process is we make a rib cut. And a rib cut is a cut made with the grain, and we make that on the table saw. Now, the table saws in our shop, if I was going to pick one saw that I could have, you know, that is the most versatile, it would be the table saw, because you can do the most things with it. And I like to tell students that, you know, you can do hundreds of things with a table saw, but we teach them two. We teach them the basics of a rip cut, and we teach them the basics of a cross cut, but it's capable of much more. Table saw is basically just a table with a blade attached to it. This one is a 10-inch diameter blade. There are two blade adjustments that you make when you use the table saw, and they're the first things you need to look at. One is blade height, and the other one is blade angle. And there's two wheels. There's one on the front which controls the elevation, and there's one on the side that controls the angle. And this table saw can tilt from 0 to 45 degrees. And we don't use that feature in Woods 1, but you need to know that it exists, because you might come up to make a cut and maybe somebody went to adjust it, and it could be right there, it's at 1 degree. Well, it's really hard to tell the difference. So we encourage students to check it, make sure it's at 0. And what they would find if they cut all the pieces at 1 degree is that nothing fits very well. And we are trying to get more of a furniture quality project here. So, first two things you adjust are blade angle, blade height. Blade height, we want the blade to be about a 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch above the material. And that's about the thickness of the wood. The main thing to staying safe on a table saw is that your board has to be stable, and something has to be guiding the board. And there's two major apparatuses on a table saw that can guide the wood. The main one is the rip fence. And just like we said on the joiner, if something has a fence, there's a reason, and you need to keep your material tight against it. But one of the reasons for our milling process, and why we did what we did, why we planed it and why we jointed it, when we planed it, it made it nice and flat on the tabletop. And when we ran it through the jointer, it gave us a nice straight edge to run against the rip fence. Quick thing about the adjustments on the table saw, you'll notice that there's some knobs in the middle of the wheel. What those knobs do is they tighten down the adjustment and keep it from moving. And we point that out because you don't necessarily always have to use them, and then when you do use them, you don't have to make them very tight. But if you go to make an adjustment and the wheel turns with some difficulty, it could be that one of these are tightened down and you should not force it. It takes a lot of strength to make the adjustment. Something's wrong. Come get one of the teachers, but usually you can just loosen the knob and it goes pretty freely. Well, the best thing about the table saw to me is if you want a board at a certain width, you just set it at that width and you send the board through. You cut the wood, you set the table saw up to cut what you want to keep. And by that we mean that quite often, if we say that we want a student to cut a board that's 4 inches wide, and they measure the board and it's about, it's 9 1/4. So if I say cut a 4-inch board, some people will think, well, that means I need to cut 5 1/4 off. We don't want you to think in that fashion. We want you to think, what do you want to keep? If you want a 4-inch board, you set it at 4 inches. Well, in this case, for our Viking box project, we're going to set it at 4 1/4. So we unlock the fence, it slides back and forth. There's a lens with a crosshair and a tape measure, and we just set it right to the measurement we want, and then we lock it down. And when we lock it down, it makes the fence, it locks it in, and it makes it parallel with the blade. Well, one of the big differences that we want to point out at this time is that this table saw and that table saw are identical except for the guard systems. And for that reason, this is the only table saw that students will use to make their rip cuts, because this table saw's guard system has safety features which I think is the biggest hazard of a table saw, which is a kickback. Most people would be obviously concerned about cutting their fingers. This saw is equipped with a special safety system that may prevent that, which we'll talk more about later, but you don't want to rely on that. But usually, after we say everything we're going to say about the table saw, people stay pretty far from the blades. And at that point, the biggest hazard is a kickback. If I send a board in and it gets bound up, it gets twisted, all that force from the table saw is transferred to the board, and the board can come shooting out. And we have evidence, we have results of bad kickbacks in our other shop, which I can show you later. But this particular guard helps prevent that. This part of the guard is a material splitter, and what that does is my board travels in, and the kerf is created by the blade. This material splitter keeps that kerf apart. And then as the board continues on, it engages these kickback pawls, which have pretty strong springs in them, and they're intended to keep the board from kicking back, but they don't always work. So all these safety features, at least the way we coach our kids, is that you want to handle the board as if they're not going to work. You don't want to rely on them. You want to place your hands and your body in a manner which, if they did fail, you'd still be safe. Well, we'll see if it works this time. Didn't work. It's supposed to dig in. So that's a good reason right there why you wouldn't want to rely on that working every time. Okay, so I'm ready to run my board. I've got the blade set at the right height, about 1/4 inch above the material. I'm at 0 degrees. My board's been planed. It's got a nice straight edge. It's good and stable on the table saw. But because I want to avoid getting hit by a kickback, it's important how I position my body. One thing for sure, when I'm making a rip cut on the table saw, I would never stand directly behind the board, because I would, I'd catch one in the gut. Usually, 90% of the time, when I cut on the table saw, I stand to the left. I turn my body. I usually put my left hip against the saw, and I'm really pushing this way towards the fence. There are times when I might stand over on the right, pulling back towards the fence. That's not very often, but the main point here is that the best place to stand is wherever you have the best control of the stock, and you're least likely to be hit by a kickback. So in my situation, I want 4 1/4. And once again, like on the joiner, the 4-inch rule comes into play. There's no way that I can control this board and keep my fingers 4 inches from the blade. So as I mentioned earlier, we have all kinds of styles of push sticks. This one in particular is the one that we use for our rips. And the rule with push sticks is generally the wider's better. If you have a wide rip you're doing, you want one with a little bit wider heel, but you don't want the push stick so wide that it runs into the guard. This would be the appropriate one for this cut. When I do my sign-offs on the table saw with students and I show them exactly how they're going to do their rip cut, the first thing I'll say is show me how you're going to stand and show me how you're going to hold the board. And I want them to stand with their left hip towards the saw, out of the path of the board, but just like a bullfighter, they get up really close to the path, but not quite in the path. Then they take their left hand and with their thumb, they push the board down, otherwise it has a tendency to tip. And then they take their index finger, and I ask students to curl their fingers back, to point back towards them, not splayed out towards the blade. So I'm pushing actually towards the fence. My concentration's there. And I station this hand right up by the guard. I just don't go past it. And it's important to note here that I am going to be pushing against the fence, but only up until where the board enters the blade. After the board enters the blade, I don't want to push against the blade anymore because I might get it to bind and to kick back. I only push in this direction as I feed it in. Once it's fed in, the blade and the splitter keep it generally against the fence. This particular table saw is a Sawstop brand table saw, which we show a video on later, but long story short, it's not even close. It is the safest table saw made. This has an electronic system that senses when flesh contacts the blade. And I didn't even notice it when we first got them, but I'd be up here doing my demonstrations and somebody pointed out that the lights were blinking on the saw. Well, it knows I'm touching it and it doesn't like it. When you have a solid green, that means that it's done a systems check, everything's supposedly in good shape and it's ready to go. But if the lights are blinking or any other color but green are flashing, there's a whole menu on the side that tells you what they mean. But basically, if it's not solid green, don't touch it and don't use it. The way this saw works, it sends an electrical impulse through the blade, and if flesh contacts it, your body absorbs some of that electricity, and it causes a voltage drop. And that triggers a sensor inside this brake cartridge, which shoots this aluminum pawl into the blade with a really strong spring, and it drops it in about 0.005 of a second. It drops it so fast that you can't really see it. They say it's 10 times faster than a car's airbag. And this is a tremendous safety feature, and it's the reason we bought these saws. But again, it's electronics connected to a device that vibrates, has heat, has a lot of dust. I don't want to depend on it, but I feel a lot better knowing that it's there. And this one was tripped last year. And typically where in the past maybe somebody might have lost a digit, they might just need a Band-Aid. But one of the things I want to point out at this time is that you can trip this system even when the saw is coasting down. So the saw is on, I turn it off, the blade's still coasting, but the system still works. And we have had this system tripped about 3 times with students reaching into the blade to get that piece of scrap before the blade was done turning. And in a couple cases, the blade was only traveling about this fast. It was about ready to stop. They touched it, they didn't hear anything, the blade was still there, but it did engage the system, which wastes the cartridge, which at least at this point is about $80 or $90 to replace. So they don't want that on the student fees. So if you make a cut and you still have scrap left that you need to get to, number one, you wait till the saw comes to a complete stop, you wait till you have a solid green, and then it's safe to grab it. But I still suggest that you get in the habit of using a piece of wood to move it from the blade, just to kind of train your body to react that way around the blade. Well, for this system to work, first thing I do is I turn the saw on. It goes through its system check. And when I get a solid green, I can go. It says that everything's ready. And then I gently pull out the start paddle. And I want to emphasize gently because it's on a little bit of a delay. So you pull it and nothing happens for a split second, and then the blade engages. So just pull it gently and then quit pulling it, or you pull it right off the control box. Set it 4 1/4. Tight against the fence. Thumbs holding it down on the table, index fingers pushing in. This hand is not going to go past the guard. It's going to be right up to the guard. And I start to feed my board. And now I've gone as far as I can with my unprotected hand. Now I'm going to take the push stick, and I'm going to put it on the board, and then this hand comes away. And my goal is to clear the whole guard assembly. And in this case, we're going to make 2 rips because we need 2 rips for our box at 10 1/4 or 4 1/4. So I do the same process again. Push stick goes on, hand comes away. And there I have my 2 4 1/4 rips. Well, this is where people get into trouble. They reach for that scrap and it triggers the system. So again, you wait until you have a solid green. But even then, I'm not going to grab it anywhere near the blade. I'm going to grab it well beyond, and I'm only doing this because it's stopped. And I just pull the piece straight out, and now it's ready to use. Well, I mentioned before that sometimes boards get stuck. It happens in here all the time, depending on how gnarly a piece of pine might be. But a lot of times there is pressure built up in the grains of the board, and you can't always tell which board's going to give you trouble. But what happens is you start to send this into the saw, and literally, we've had it happen before, the pressure inside the board, even though you have a kerf cut by the blade, the pressure inside the board will pull itself right back together. And again, that's what that splitter's there to do. It's there to keep that from happening and keep from a kickback. The other thing, and I mentioned before, you have the kickback pawls that are supposed to grab the board. And then sometimes you're running something through and it gets stuck. And sometimes it's because you have a little scrap caught in the guard that you didn't notice. But whatever the reason, if you get into a situation where you're making a cut and the board just won't go, you don't force it. You keep one hand on the board, you do not try to back it out. You keep one hand on the board, you reach down, turn the saw off, and you wait. And you wait until the blade comes to a complete stop, and then you pull it out, and then we figure out, why it didn't go through. The other point I like to make about the ripping on the table saw, board's got to be at least 10 inches long, just like the planer, just like the joiner. But the board also has to be longer than it is wide as it goes through the saw, otherwise it's not stable on the saw. And there's some people that will come up and rationalize, well, this board is over 10 inches long, why can't I cut it on the table saw? Well, it's not 10 inches long along the fence, and it needs to be longer than it is wide as it goes through for it to ride safely on the fence. If I did want to make this cut, which would then be a cross cut on the table saw, I would use this device, which is called a miter gauge. I move the fence away. Now this board's stable. But one thing or the other has to guide the board, whichever one's appropriate. One thing I would never do is I would never attempt to do what's called a freehand cut, where I don't use either one. I just send it in and hold the board. That is going to be a kickback and maybe lifeline. This particular saw, we can make skinny rips on it, and by a skinny rip, at least for this guard system, I would call a skinny rip about 1 inch. 1 inch, I can still use the guard, and I can barely get a push stick through there. Raise that a little bit. Put my jointed edge against the fence. Start that. Again, I'm pushing it tight against the fence, but my unprotected hand does not go past the guard. There's my narrow rip, and students will make narrow rips like that when they build their Viking box lid. Now if I wanted to make a really skinny rip, I could use this device. This is called a riving knife, and on this particular saw, I can take the guard off and replace it with the riving knife, and what the riving knife does is it does the job of the splitter. And it keeps that board from pinching back down on the blade. But Woods 1 students would only use this if a teacher was supervising it. We just want you to know what it's for. It's for very narrow rips under 1 inch. So crosscuts on the table saw. As I mentioned before, the table saw, it's the most versatile saw in here. But if I did have a board that was wider than it was deep, I can make an accurate crosscut on it. Hold it tight against the miter gauge. In fact, when students do their sign-off, again, they come up and I say, you know, show me how you're going to hold the board. They grab the miter gauge in one hand and they pull the board tight against it with the other, and I want them to hold and show that they have control. And then I'm standing here and I try to wiggle it. And if I can move it, I ask them to get a better grip on it. Once they have it nice and stationary and I'm convinced, they can start the cut. And right here I'm just doing a square up cross cut, and I'm just sending it straight through. And it's important to note that once I start that cut, I am not moving side to side. It's stationary and I'm going straight through. All the way through, and I pull it away. This miter gauge goes 0 to 60 left and right. There's all kinds of adjustments and all kinds of cuts I could make, but the ones for Woods 1 are just standard rip cuts, and that's a standard cross cut. Well, there's one question on the test that asks you, can you use the miter gauge and the fence together at the same time? The simple answer is no. In fact, I just watched a video from I believe it's the American Power Tool Institute, where they show correct use of the table saw, and they just simply say don't use them together. But I was taught there are times you can use them both. The important thing to note here is that I would never, ever use a miter gauge and a fence on opposite sides of the blade. It's important to note that when I was making my rip cuts, I only had pressure on one side of the blade. All my force was between the blade and the fence. I was never pushing on the waste portion once it entered the blade. Well, that's how you get into trouble and you get a kickback on the table saw, is pressure on two sides. That's one way. If I have the fence set up and I'm pushing my material against it and I have the miter gauge on the other side, now I've got pressure on two sides and I'm probably going to get a pretty bad kickback. Usually we call that one the helicopter because it comes out of there like that. But there is a time that I was taught that you can, and that would be if the miter gauge and the fence were on the same side of the blade. And the reason we make that distinction is that now I'm only going to have pressure on one side. All my force is on this one side, and the scrap or the waste portion can just fall free. I'm not going to bind it. So that's the only time I can use the miter gauge and the fence at the same time. Well, what's the table saw best used for? The table saw is best used for rip cuts. Boards that are longer than they are wide, making cuts with the grain. It can do cross cuts with a miter gauge, but it's not your best choice in this shop. Best choice would be the next tool that will cover. But that's the basic use of our table saw in Woods 1.